For 24 years, a secret war burned across southern Africa's borders, a conflict fought in silence, hidden from the world. This is the story of the South African Border War, a brutal decade-spanning struggle that stretched from the deserts of Namibia to the jungles of Angola, becoming a forgotten front line of the Cold War and a pivotal chapter in the fight against apartheid. Imagine a continent on the verge of transformation. It's the 1960s and a wave of independence is sweeping across Africa. But in the South, one nation stands against this tide. South Africa, ruled by the iron fist of apartheid, a system of institutionalized racial segregation. The regime not only controlled its own territory, but also governed neighboring Namibia, then known as Southwest Africa. As newly independent African nations rallied against apartheid, Pretoria saw enemies at every border. The government, led by the National Party, feared that these anti-colonial movements would inspire revolution at home. To the West, they sold a simple story. They were a bastion against communism, a bulwark holding back the Soviet tide. This narrative earned them the quiet support of powerful allies, including the United States and the United Kingdom, who saw them as a necessary, if uncomfortable, partner. But the winds of change could not be stopped. On August 26, 1966, in a remote village in northern Namibia called Omagulagwambash, a small group of guerrillas clashed with South African police. These fighters belonged to SWAPO, the Southwest Africa People's Organization, a liberation movement determined to win independence for Namibia. This skirmish was the spark that ignited a 24-year war. SWAPO, operating from safe havens in newly independent Zambia and later Angola, began a classic insurgency campaign. For South Africa, this was more than a border dispute. It was an existential threat. The war had begun. In response, South Africa unleashed its military might. The South African Defense Force, or SADF, was deployed to crush the rebellion. What started as a police action quickly evolved into a full-scale military occupation. The border with Angola became a fortress of fences, watchtowers, and military zones. The SADF's strategy was classic counterinsurgency. Win hearts and minds where possible, but use overwhelming force where necessary. They relocated entire villages suspected of supporting SWAPO and used propaganda to label the freedom fighters as terrorists. To further complicate the moral landscape, they exploited ethnic divisions, recruiting black Namibians into the Southwest Africa Territorial Force to fight against their own countrymen. The conflict was no longer just about Namibia. It was about controlling the entire region. Then, in 1975, the game changed forever. Portugal, after its own revolution, abruptly withdrew from its African colonies, including Angola. The country immediately plunged into a vicious civil war. Three factions vied for control: the Marxist MPLA, backed by the Soviet Union, the FNLA, and UNITA, which soon found powerful allies in the United States and, crucially, South Africa. Fearing a Soviet-aligned government on its doorstep that would provide a massive base for SWAPO, South Africa made a fateful decision. In October 1975, under the codename Operation Savannah, SADF troops secretly invaded Angola. The official story was that they were protecting South African interests. The reality was a full-scale invasion designed to install a friendly government in Luanda and cripple SWAPO. The SADF, a highly disciplined and well-equipped force, advanced with lightning speed, Capturing town after town and pushing deep into Angola, they came within striking distance of the capital. But then the world turned. In a massive airlift, Cuba began flying thousands of its own troops into Angola to support the MPLA. The tide of the battle shifted dramatically. Faced with a powerful Cuban force and growing international condemnation, South Africa was forced to withdraw. Operation Savannah had failed to achieve its ultimate goal, but it had succeeded in one thing. It dragged South Africa into a direct, long-term war in Angola that would last for another 14 years. Following the invasion, the war escalated. SWAPO, now firmly supported by the new Angolan government, intensified its raids into northern Namibia. South Africa retaliated with brutal cross-border operations, launching airstrikes and ground assaults deep inside Angola. These raids often hit civilian areas, and the lines between combatant and non-combatant blurred tragically. The conflict became a proxy war, a Cold War battleground fought on African soil. The United States, through the CIA, funneled support to UNITA, while the Soviet Union and Cuba poured weapons and advisors in to support the MPLA and SWAPO. By the mid-1980s, over 50,000 Cuban soldiers were stationed in Angola, fighting directly against South African forces. Angola had become one of the hottest fronts in the Cold War, a conflict as intense as Vietnam, but almost entirely absent from Western news headlines. This brutal stalemate culminated in the largest battle fought on African soil since World War II, the Battle of Cuito, Cuanavale. Beginning in late 1987, South African forces, alongside their UNITA allies, laid siege to the strategic town of Cuito, Cuanavale. They were met by a combined force of Angolan, Cuban, and SWAPO troops. For 6 months, the battle raged. It was a brutal slugfest of tanks, artillery, and aircraft. South Africa inflicted heavy losses and claimed a tactical victory, but they failed to take the town. The Angolan and Cuban forces held their ground. For Pretoria, this was a strategic defeat. It proved that the SADF was not invincible and that African liberation movements, with powerful allies, could stand against them. The psychological impact was immense. Years later, Nelson Mandela would call it the turning point for the liberation of our continent. The costly stalemate at Cuito, Cuanavale broke the political will of all sides. The war had become too expensive in both blood and treasure. Under mediation from the United States and the United Nations, peace talks began. In December 1988, South Africa, Angola, and Cuba signed a tripartite accord in New York. The deal was simple. Cuban troops would withdraw from Angola, and in return, South Africa would end its occupation of Namibia and allow for its independence. On March 21, 1990, Namibia finally became an independent nation, with SWAPO leader Sam Nujoma as its first president. The border war was over. The war's legacy is complex and painful. It claimed over 20,000 lives and left a trail of destruction across the region. For South Africa, the war was a military and political failure. It failed to stop Namibian independence and bled the apartheid state of resources and morale, accelerating its eventual collapse. Just weeks before Namibia's independence, Nelson Mandela was released from prison, heralding the end of apartheid. The border war ended where apartheid began in fear, but the struggle for freedom, fought by countless men and women across borders, proved that no wall, no fence, and no army could contain the desire for liberation. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story important, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more hidden histories. We'll see you next time.